I went to my wife and her lover's romantic dinner and asked the waiter to leave the divorce letter on their table. When she opened the letter, she was shocked and desperate and called me scared, but I had already made my decision. She never expected that. She never imagined that the man who always put her first would have the courage to expose the dirtiest secret of her life in the setting she chose to celebrate her own betrayal. And that was exactly what gave me the strength to continue sitting at a distance, observing. Because there, for the first time, I wasn't the man deceived, it was she who felt the pain of despair. And the lover? He didn't seem to understand what was happening until he read the letter with her. A short, direct letter, with no space for explanations or attempts to apologize. A letter that elegantly said that I was freeing myself, not just from her, but from everything she represented. Until that moment, she thought she was in control. He spent weeks planning his meetings, manipulating schedules, taking care of every detail so that I would never suspect. Kisses at the gate before leaving, calls during lunch saying he loved me, compliments on my perfume when I got home from work, promises of children that I now know I never really wanted. She thought she lied perfectly. And I, an idiot, fed the lie with gusto, because I believed that we had overcome the difficult phases and were finally okay. While I dreamed of renewing our vows and preparing surprises for our wedding anniversary, she gave herself to another, smiling, moaning, making promises that no longer belonged to me. She started to dress better, walk lighter, as if her soul had found rest. And I believed it was love. Love for me. But it wasn't. I discovered everything by chance, as often happens in real tragedies. A phone forgotten on the table, a notification, a silly curiosity, and suddenly the world I knew collapsed beneath my feet. First came denial. That absurd feeling that it couldn't be true. Then the anger. A dry, bitter, silent anger. The desire to scream, destroy everything, confront, but also the fear that if I revealed that I knew, she would run away with him, free of any consequences. It was then that I decided to watch it. I wanted to see how far she would go. He wanted to know how far he would be able to go to keep the lie standing. I wanted to get revenge. I discovered everything. Where they met, which restaurant they preferred, what their names were, what they said to each other in intimate moments. And while she made plans with him, I made mine. I planned every detail of the dinner that would change our lives forever. I chose the table. I agreed with the waiter. I wrote the letter with surgical precision, without a word of hate, just raw truths. As she smiled at him, I smiled to myself, because I knew I was about to give back to the world the same pain I received. But what she didn't expect, what no one could have predicted, is that that night, at the exact moment she destroyed our marriage in a toast with her lover, I had already rebuilt my future. A future that included someone she knew. Someone I would never have imagined. Someone she had always been envious of, and who was now about to take the place she threw away with so much contempt. Because what she didn't know is that life demands, and sometimes it demands in a poetic way. When she called me, panicked, crying, saying, "It's not what you think," I just listened. I listened calmly, with the silence of someone who no longer feels anything, of someone who no longer recognizes that voice as part of their story. She begged to talk, said she had an explanation, but the explanation never existed. I had understood everything. Her betrayal wasn't just physical. It was the betrayal of someone who knew about my love and still chose to tear it apart. The betrayal of someone who looked in the mirror and decided they deserved more than true love. She didn't just lose her husband. She lost the respect of her daughter, who found out everything when she tried to defend her and discovered the truth behind the lies. He lost friends, lost confidence, lost the admiration he earned with effort. But what destroyed her most was what came after. Because when she tried to look for me, when she finally realized she had made the biggest mistake of her life, it was already too late. I was already with someone else. A woman who knew her better than anyone. Who has always been around, who has heard her speak ill of me, who has already been the target of her silent contempt. A woman she would never believe I would have the courage to get involved with. She was betrayed by her own ego, by the certainty that I would always be there waiting. And when he realized that he was no longer the center of everything, it was as if the ground opened beneath his feet. The man she exchanged for fleeting adventures now smiled hand in hand with someone she knew very well. Someone who one day she made a point of humiliating. Someone who now took his place in my life, in my home, in my bed, and perhaps, soon, at the altar. I know you want to know who this woman is. And the most curious thing is that it was always there. Always. At every family gathering, at every party, at every moment where she, my ex, believed she was irreplaceable. But everything changed, and the betrayal she thought she was committing in secret became the beginning of her greatest downfall. Now, every time she sees me, she doesn't just see the man she lost. She sees the reflection of what she chose to destroy. And if you think this story ends here, you are wrong. Because what happened after that dinner was even more surprising. What came to light days later, no one could have ever imagined. The biggest revelation of all was yet to come, and it would forever transform the way this story would be remembered. Want to know what it was? So come with me. Because this is just the beginning. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support, romanticize or justify any type of betrayal. All stories are fictitious, but inspired by real situations to show, without filters, how infidelity has the power to destroy homes, hearts and futures. Get ready. Because today's story will mess with your emotions and make you rethink everything you believe about love, loyalty and consequences. Now sit back, take a deep breath, and be ready to hear a shocking story. It was difficult to look at that couple and not believe that they were made for each other. Daniel and Laura met at the beginning of college, and even though they had completely different lives, there was an immediate connection between them, one that seems to defy time and logic. He, the son of a retired mechanic, had worked in workshops since he was a teenager to help around the house, always silent, meticulous, the type of man who observed before acting. She, the only daughter of a university professor, grew up surrounded by books and dreams, always very communicative, charming, full of plans. They were opposites, yes, but they worked like two pieces of a puzzle that, once joined together, seemed impossible to separate. The difference between their worlds did not separate them, on the contrary, it was precisely this that brought them closer together. Laura saw in Daniel the security and stability that she never had in the volatile relationships of her youth. Daniel saw in her the chance to get out of the bubble that limited his dreams, a woman who believed in him before he even knew where he wanted to go. Their courtship was a natural, almost silent process. There were no grand public declarations or impulsive vows. It was something built on small kindnesses, on afternoons studying together, on confidences exchanged on the park bench while sharing a cheap ice cream. It was in the 4th year of college that they decided to live together, and a year later, Daniel proposed to Laura during a simple trip to the mountains, with a ring bought in installments and a sincere sentence said in the middle of a beautiful silence, in front of a lit fireplace. She said yes with teary eyes and ragged breaths, and he never forgot the way she looked at him at that moment, as if she were seeing the love of her entire life in front of her. The wedding was intimate, with only family and close friends. Daniel had already landed a good position as an engineer at a growing construction company, while Laura taught at a high school and dreamed of publishing a book one day. They lived in a small but cozy house, which they renovated together with the savings they had. In every corner of the house there was a detail that bore their mark, a painting chosen by her, a piece of furniture restored by him, plants that she insisted on taking care of, even when she forgot to water. It wasn't a luxurious life, but it was a life built carefully, brick by brick, as Daniel always believed it should be. Over time, routines began to overlap. Daniel started leaving home earlier and earlier and arriving later and later, immersed in spreadsheets, meetings and tight deadlines. Laura, on the other hand, immersed herself in her literary projects and in the school corridors, where she was admired by students and colleagues for her charisma and empathy. Little by little, they began to live more in parallel than together. There was still affection, respect, admiration, but moments of deep connection became rarer, replaced by busy schedules and exhausted nights. And yet, whenever they were together, there was something that kept them connected. A touch, a look, the memory of everything they once were. Daniel never stopped loving Lara, even though he often felt he no longer knew how to reach her. She, in turn, found herself immersed in a kind of silent solitude, missing a presence that technically never left. But she didn't complain, she didn't ask for more. He had learned over the years that to love was also to accept the silence of others. Even so, sometimes the emptiness of the room made her cry alone in the shower, where no one could see her. Daniel, on the other hand, lived tormented by the guilt of no longer being able to demonstrate as he used to, as if the obligations of adult life had consumed the spontaneous and passionate man he once was. In the eyes of others, they remained the perfect couple. They were always present at family birthdays, dinners with friends, smiling in photos. No one imagined how much effort there was behind those smiles. They were good people, both of them, and they knew it. They had flaws, of course, but they tried hard not to let them dominate what they built. They shared accounts, divided tasks, and even made plans for the future. They sometimes talked about children. Lara said she wanted to be a mother before she was 35, and Daniel agreed, even with his heart tight with fear, wondering if he could be half the father his had been. And even with all the doubts, they continued. Because they loved each other. Or at least, they thought so. There were moments when the passion rekindled. An isolated weekend, a special dinner prepared by her, a longer touch before bed. In those moments, it seemed like everything was still there, you just had to remember what it was like. But soon everyday life began to swallow everything again. Daniel blamed himself for not being there more, for not noticing the details, for not asking her how her day was. Lara blamed herself for missing something she couldn't even name. Sometimes she thought that maybe it was the fault of time, of life, of tiredness. Sometimes I thought maybe I was expecting too much. Other times, I just accepted that life as a couple wasn't just made up of charms. But there was something about Lara that Daniel never clearly understood. A restlessness. A hunger for recognition that had always haunted her. She needed to be seen, admired, desired. And although Daniel loved her, his love was quieter than she would have liked. She wanted to be touched with her eyes, with her words, with an unexpected gesture. I wanted to feel like I was still special, irreplaceable. But I never said it out loud. I was ashamed of appearing fragile, selfish. So I kept everything in small silences, in thoughts that came before going to sleep, in lost glances out the living room window. Daniel, in turn, was the kind of man who loved actions. He fixed her car without her asking, prepared coffee when she woke up early, looked for the plants she dreamed of having in the garden. But I never knew how to say. He was never good with words. And Lara, even though she understood, sometimes she missed listening. He thought she knew how much she was loved. She thought he couldn't see anymore. And in this difference in language, the abyss grew. Despite this, they still shared movie nights, short trips, meetings with the same old friends. Their lives continued, with stability and even a certain tenderness in the most automatic gestures. There were plans to change cars, to do a kitchen renovation, to visit her parents in the south on the next vacation. Lara even started writing a new novel, inspired by real stories she heard from students. Daniel, even without understanding much, encouraged her. He said she had talent, that the world needed her stories. She smiled, but sometimes she thought he said it more out of habit than out of real enthusiasm. Even with everything, there was still a feeling that held them back. Maybe it was love, maybe it was gratitude. Maybe it was just fear of starting over. But there was. And they both continued to believe that they were on the right path. Until the small absences started to accumulate. A forgetfulness here, a lack of time there, a message that was not given, an invitation refused. Minimal things, but like constant drops, they dug a deep hole. Neither of them realized how far they were growing apart. Because that's how it happens, slowly. There are no screams, no explosions. Just a succession of silences that become deafening. Lara started spending more time away from home, citing school commitments, literary events, and meeting friends. Daniel didn't suspect it. He trusted her. Always trusted. And even when she seemed more distant, more distracted, he believed it was just a phase, like so many others they've faced. That's why he never asked too much. Never invaded. She, in turn, felt suffocated between loyalty to what they had built and the restlessness that grew inside her chest. It was as if there were two worlds, and she was torn between them. One safe and predictable, the other uncertain but full of emotion. Little by little, the old promises were being shelved. Photos on social media have decreased. Long conversations at the end of the day turned into quick sentences. Kisses before bed became a habit. But there was still love. There was. Until the day when the certainty of one of them turned into doubt. And doubt, when left unspoken, corrodes in silence. Now tell me, what happens when someone feels like they are being left behind, even though no one has left yet? What happens when the heart wants to scream, but the mouth doesn't know how to speak anymore? And, most importantly, what happens when life decides to show you that everything you thought was unshakable can fall apart in the blink of an eye? The answer is yet to come. Daniel had been going through a particularly demanding period at work. Tight goals and increasing pressure from management kept him working hours at the office, immersed in projects that seemed to never end. The routine consumed him in silence, but he remained firm, believing that all that effort would bear fruit. Lara, on the other hand, was experiencing a phase of recognition at school, invited to lead pedagogical projects and participate in literary circles at other institutions. She was called to events, to interviews, and her name began to circulate in spaces where, until recently, she had only observed from afar. The two lived in different directions, like two parallel lines that run without crossing each other, and even when they met, there wasn't much to say. The topics ended quickly, and the silences were longer than before. Daniel noticed, but preferred not to delve deeper. I thought it was just a phase, just one of many. Lara noticed it too, but the feeling of detachment left her with a guilt that she preferred to ignore. There was a Saturday when Daniel came home early, wanting to surprise her with dinner for two. She did the shopping, prepared the dish she liked most and lit candles on the porch. When she called to find out where she was, Lara replied, in a broken voice, that she had been called at the last minute for a lecture at a partner school. He apologized, said he would be back late, and he, as always, understood. He dined alone, but kept the table set, waiting for her until almost midnight. When she arrived, tired, he just smiled and said it was okay, they could do it another day. She smiled back, lightly touched his shoulder, and went straight to the shower. Daniel didn't realize it, but that quick touch was colder than he deserved. Over the next month, Lara started going out more frequently. I justified it with school events, meetings with authors, project meetings. Daniel never questioned. I trusted. And it was precisely this unshakable confidence that, ironically, hurt her. Every time he looked at her tenderly, without noticing the gulf between them, she felt smaller. She wanted to scream, cry, ask him to see her again like before, but she couldn't. And then she would smile, kiss him on the forehead and leave, leaving behind a trail of perfume and a silence heavier than any absence. The first time was in a discreet cafe, during an academic event. Lara met Marco by chance, introduced by a mutual colleague. He was direct, charming, he spoke about literature with a passion that she no longer saw in anyone around him. They talked like old acquaintances, laughed loudly, shared stories, and at the end of the night, she realized that there was something there. It wasn't love, maybe it wasn't even desire. It was just the feeling of being seen. To be heard. Of being important. He praised his text, his way of speaking, his way of thinking. He touched her hand lightly and said that she deserved to be read by millions. They were words that echoed inside her with a force she couldn't ignore. In the following days, they exchanged messages. First about books, then about life. Then about them. Marco knew she was married, but he didn't ask questions. Lara didn't hide it, but she didn't go deeper either. It was as if, by keeping the relationship in a parallel space, she was able to justify to herself that nothing wrong was happening. Until, one late afternoon, after a lecture, the two were alone in the parking lot. Marco held her face with both hands and asked if he could kiss her. She hesitated. He thought of Daniel. He thought about the house, about Friday nights watching series, about the promises made with his eyes closed. But I didn't say no. The kiss happened as if it were inevitable. As if it was already written. It was intense, time-consuming, and when it ended, Lara was shaking. Marco smiled, wrapped her in a firm hug and said that this didn't need to be the end. She silently nodded with an almost imperceptible gesture. That night, when he got home, Daniel was sleeping on the couch with the television on. Lara covered him with the duvet, turned off the lights and went to the bedroom. She felt dirty, but also alive. And that confused her. Meetings with Marco became weekly. In cafes, in hotel rooms, in empty school rooms at alternative times. They didn't talk about the future, nor about feelings. They only lived in the moment. Marco was an escape. A relief from the anguish she had been carrying for months. She knew it wouldn't last, but at that moment, that was all she wanted. Daniel, in turn, began to notice changes. The different perfume, the impatience with simple questions, the cell phone always facing down. But he denied it to himself. I thought it was tiredness, work pressure, stress. Still, something inside him began to stir. One rainy Saturday, Lara left her unlocked cell phone on the kitchen table. Daniel was washing the dishes when the appliance vibrated. An almost involuntary instinct made him look. It was a message from Marco. The screen only displayed a snippet, tomorrow, same place, same time. I can't wait to. The rest was cut off by the notification. The blood ran cold. The body became rigid. The sound of tap water became a distant noise. Daniel dried his hands and, on impulse, unlocked his cell phone. What he read in the next few minutes tore something inside him that would never heal in the same way again. The messages were clear, intimate, ancient. There were photos, confessions, plans. There were laughs and groans typed, there was a story he never knew existed. For a second, Daniel wanted to confront her immediately. But he took a deep breath. I didn't say anything. He returned the cell phone to its place and returned to the sink. He decided to wait. I needed to understand. He needed to see it with his own eyes. Over the next few days, he observed Lara with a calm he didn't feel. She always left at the same time, with the same excuse. He started to follow. He discovered the hotel, the cafe, the places. He saw the two of them meeting, touching, entering together. There was no longer any doubt. It was real. He was the one on the outside. Daniel didn't cry. Not at that moment. Something inside him was too cold. A part that he himself was unaware of. He started planning. I didn't want revenge on impulse. I wanted justice. I wanted her to know exactly what she had destroyed. He chose a restaurant, discovered the location of one of the upcoming meetings and made a reservation for the same night. He arrived early and spoke to the waiter. He asked me to leave the envelope on the table when he left. In the envelope, there was no fury. There was clarity. There was closure. He watched from afar, from another table, with his face partially covered by the menu. You saw when she arrived. He saw when he smiled. He saw it when he sat down facing Marco. He saw the laughter, the wine, the sparkle in the eyes that were no longer meant for him. He waited for the right moment, got up, discreetly handed the envelope to the waiter, left the restaurant with firm steps and his heart on fire. Minutes later, the cell phone vibrated. It was her. The calls came in sequence. Didn't answer. There was nothing more to say. What there was to hear, he had already heard in the messages he read. What there was to see, he had already seen with his own eyes. But there was something she still didn't know. Something that would change everything. A detail that would make that betrayal even more bitter. And the cruelest thing, is that this detail was closer than she could imagine. When Lara saw the envelope on the table, her first impulse was to smile, thinking it was a surprise from Marco. Maybe a romantic note, or tickets to an event. But the smile froze before it even reached the corner of his lips when he recognized the handwriting. He opened the envelope with shaking hands, and as he read the words Daniel had written, he felt his stomach sink as if he were falling into a bottomless abyss. The letter was clear, elegant, precise. No offense, no out of control, just the brutal realization that he knew everything and that was the end point. She tried to hide her shock, but her eyes filled with tears instantly, and the fork she was holding fell from her hand as if it had lost its strength. Marco looked at her with confusion, walked over and asked if everything was okay, but she had already gotten up, had her cell phone in her hand, calling Daniel in desperation. Calls were not answered. Lara left the restaurant in a daze, feeling the world spinning around her. Marco followed, trying to understand what was happening, but she didn't say anything. I just wanted to get home. He got into the car shaking, drove without knowing exactly where, until he realized that, even without a destination, he was going home. When he entered, everything seemed untouched. The room in order, the lights off, the familiar smell in the air. But there was an emptiness, something in the air that screamed absence. He went up to his room and found his suitcase in the corner, open but organized, as if it had been packed calmly. On the nightstand, the wedding ring. She approached, touched the cold metal with her fingers, and only then did the Real crying come. Hours passed until the phone finally rang. It was him. She answered with a broken voice, asking him to come back, that they needed to talk, that they could resolve it, that none of this needed to end like this. Daniel kept his voice firm, calm, almost impersonal. He said that there was no more room for conversation, that the decisions had already been made and that the lawyers would soon get in touch. She insisted, begged, asked for forgiveness, but he remained irreducible. At the end of the call, she took a deep breath and asked if there was anything else he wanted to say. There was a long, piercing silence. And then, he said yes. That there was something she needed to know, but that she preferred to talk about in person. That she deserved to hear with her own ears. 2 days later, they met. In a quiet park, away from eyes, they sat on a bench, distant, like two strangers. Lara was haggard, with deep circles under her eyes and a pale face. Daniel, in turn, seemed calmer, as if he had weathered the worst of the storm. For a while, only the sound of birds and leaves filled the space between them. She tried to start, but he raised his hand asking for silence, and then he began to speak, bluntly, with an almost resigned tone. He said that he had discovered everything, that he had known about the case for weeks, that he had followed every step, every message exchange, every lie. She tried to interrupt, to justify, but he didn't allow it. He said he wasn't there to discuss the betrayal. That, for him, was already resolved. What he wanted to tell was something else. A detail she had no idea about. Something that completely changed the weight of what she had done. And then, with his voice breaking and his eyes fixed on hers, he revealed that the new person he was seeing, was Anna. The silence that followed was so dense that it seemed as if the world had stopped for a second. Lara frowned, as if she didn't understand. Dwarf? Which Anna? He took a deep breath, leaned forward slightly and replied, Anna, her best friend, the one with whom she shared confidences, secrets, jokes. The one who frequented their house, who had dinner with them, who said she admired their marriage. The impact was immediate. Lara put her hands to her face, as if she needed to hide her shocked expression, but she couldn't contain the scream that escaped, hoarse, desperate. Like this? How was this possible? She stammered in disjointed sentences, asking when, why, how did this happen? Daniel waited for her to finish, and then told her. He said it hadn't been planned, that everything happened after the betrayal was discovered. Who, in a moment of total disorientation, found solace in an unexpected friendship, in someone who listened to him without judgment, who was there to welcome him when he could no longer stand up on his own. Lara insisted that it didn't make sense, that Anna would never do that to her. But he remained calm. He said he wasn't there to justify anything, just to let her know. That he wasn't with Anna out of revenge. That, as unbelievable as it seemed, something true had been born from that pain. And now, he didn't want to go back. I didn't want to rebuild what was broken. He wanted to move on, with someone who, despite everything, made him feel alive again. She stood up abruptly, walked a few steps and came back, visibly disoriented. She said she felt betrayed twice, that the world was falling apart. He replied that he knew exactly what that feeling was like. And if she could still feel it, it was because not everything inside her had died. She sat down again, her gaze lost on the horizon, while tears flowed uncontrollably. Daniel then stood up, looked at her with a mix of pain and compassion, and said that, despite everything, he hoped she would find a way. And that, one day, she could forgive herself. Before leaving, he left an envelope in her hands. Not with resentment, but with the elegance that always accompanied him. It was a letter. One last one. He wrote so that she could understand not the end, but everything that led up to it. Inside, between words written with the ink of truth, was the greatest gift he could give her, the mirror that she avoided looking at so much. Lara remained on the bench for long minutes after he left. When he finally had the courage to open the envelope, he found not just words, but the exact line where everything began to fall apart. The first time she stopped looking at him, the first time he stopped listening to what she wasn't saying. There were described the small daily deaths of love, the silent choices, the muffled screams, the averted looks. There it was. And, in the end, the phrase that took her down once and for all, "You lost me before you betrayed me. You just didn't realize." Nothing more was said. Nothing more needed to be said. The secret she would never have imagined, seeing Daniel next to the only person she could ever bear to see taking his place, was now a reality. And there was no going back. Lara spent the next day as if floating in a weightless space. Daniel's words echoed in her mind like a broken bell, and each strike was a cruel reminder of the reality she had refused to see. The unanswered messages, the looks that Anna gave her when she talked about Daniel, the advice that seemed to camouflage a hidden interest. Everything now made sense, or at least a bitter, unfair kind of sense. She tried to sleep, but the pillow felt like it was made of thorns. The room was filled with his scent, the closet half empty, the sound of silence screaming in the walls. He got up in the middle of the night and stared at his own reflection in the bathroom mirror, wondering how someone could become so unrecognizable without realizing it. The next day, driven by a need that even she didn't quite understand, she went to Anna's apartment. She rang the doorbell with her cold fingers, her heart beating at a rhythm that made her chest hurt. When the door opened, Anna emerged with her hair tied up in a messy way, wearing a loose t-shirt, visibly surprised. The expression that would once have been one of excitement upon seeing her was now a wall of caution. Lara entered without being invited. She walked to the living room, where everything seemed too normal, and that infuriated her. "And truth?" he asked in a low, trembling voice, almost a whisper. Anna closed the door slowly, took a deep breath and nodded. He didn't try to deny it, he didn't make excuses, he didn't look for words to soften what was raw. Lara stared at her friend for long seconds, waiting for some gesture that would justify the absurdity, but all she found was a dry silence, a look of restrained compassion. "How could you?" he said then, more firmly, his tone rising with the weight of each memory. "How did you have the courage to listen to my outbursts, to see me falling apart, and yet, still lie down with him?" Anna crossed her arms, not in defense, but as if trying to keep herself together. He spoke calmly, as he always did, but this time there was no sweetness. I didn't plan anything, Lara. I didn't wish that. When he came to me, he was destroyed. You don't know what he went through, Lara laughed, a nervous, indignant laugh, as if it were a grotesque joke. I don't know what he went through. Are you serious? I lost my husband and my best friend all at once, and you want to talk to me about pain? Anna approached, tried to touch her arm, but was pushed away with a sudden movement. Don't touch me. Tell me something, since when did you like him? Since we met. When you smiled at parties at my house, was it for me or for him? Anna took a deep breath. I didn't like him before. I never looked at him with different eyes. But when he showed up here, with everything he had discovered, with that pain you've never seen, something in me changed, Lara screamed in response, without thinking, just letting it out, because you always wanted to be me. Always. I wanted my life, my marriage, my place. And now it has everything. Congratulations, Anna. The friend retreated, hurt, but did not fight back. He remained silent for a few seconds and then replied, in a low voice, if I wanted to be you, Lara, I would have done it much sooner. I had the opportunity. You told me everything. But I didn't want Daniel. I wanted you to take care of him. And you didn't care. The words hit her chest like a stone, and Lara was left without reaction. Because, as much as they hurt, there was a hint of truth in them. She never imagined she could lose him. He never thought it was possible. He always believed that, no matter how much he made mistakes, he would be there. He sat on the sofa, his face in his hands, breathing heavily. Anna didn't come any closer. She just stood there, standing, watching, like someone watching a tragedy without being able to look away. Hours later, Lara left the building without saying anything else. The day was gray, the sky threatened rain, and she walked aimlessly, as if waiting for the pain to evaporate with her steps. But it didn't evaporate. He called the school and asked for permission. He said he needed a few days. At home, she deleted all the photos, took the wedding album off the shelf, put it in a box and placed it at the back of the closet. But that didn't erase the smiles, the touches, the promises. He called mutual friends, trying to understand how much they knew. Some said they were surprised. Others were silent. It was clear that some already knew and were just waiting for the right moment to tell them. That hurt as much as the betrayal. Daniel, in turn, had moved into a small temporary apartment. He was focused on reorganizing his life, his finances, his time. I still saw Anna frequently, but I maintained a certain emotional distance. I was too hurt to love fully again. It needed to rebuild itself. I still thought about Lara, but not with longing. I thought with regret. With that melancholy of someone who sees a house collapse from the inside even though the walls are still standing. A few weeks later, they met again, this time at the lawyer's office. It was time to agree the terms of the separation. The tension was palpable. Both avoided looking at each other for a long time. Everything was handled formally. Documents, signatures, division of assets. At the end, when everyone got up to leave, Lara called him. He hesitated, but stayed. They went to the corridor, away from the eyes of the legal representatives. She looked him in the eye for the first time in weeks. She was dejected, but there was a woman there who was no longer the same. I won't apologize, Daniel. Because nothing I say will erase what I did. But I want you to know that I understand. I understood everything. It took a while, but I understood. You weren't perfect. But you were mine. And I lost you. Alone. Daniel lowered his head, took a deep breath. I wasn't perfect either, Lara. I was wrong to keep quiet, to pretend that everything was fine when it wasn't. But I never stopped loving you. And that's exactly why I needed to go. She nodded, holding back the tears that insisted on falling. And Anna? Do you think this could turn into something real? He thought for a few seconds. I don't know. Perhaps yes. Maybe not. But it's not about her. It's about me. I needed to look at myself again. And you need it too. The two said goodbye with a brief hug, without promises, without reunions. Just a touch of two bodies that were once home and were now memories. At the end of that night, Lara sat on the porch with a glass of wine and looked up at the sky. She felt destroyed, yes, but curiously more lucid than ever. I knew nothing would ever be the same again. He knew the pain would remain for a long time. But for the first time, I saw clearly what I had previously preferred not to see. And in a corner of the city, Daniel slept peacefully, on a simple mattress, but with a lighter soul. For the first time in a long time, he didn't dream of loss. I didn't dream of guilt. Just slept. In peace. But destiny, that old artisan of the improbable, still had one last move to make. Something none of them expected. Something that would, once again, change the course of everything. Time began to carve the contours of Daniel's new life with the precision of someone shaping a scar. He occupied himself with small routines that previously seemed invisible. He had learned to live alone without carrying the weight of absence like a cross. On weekends, I immersed myself in reading and long, silent walks, where there was no room for burning memories. Little by little, the trace of the past stopped being an open cut and became a discreet mark, like a poorly done tattoo. There were nights when I still woke up with Lara's name echoing in my mind, as if my body insisted on remembering what my heart no longer recognized as belonging. But on those nights he just took a deep breath, looked at the ceiling and accepted it. Because, deep down, I knew that forgetting was not erasing. It was learning to live with the presence of absence. Lara, meanwhile, was stuck in a slower spiral. He had moved away from almost everything: school, projects, people. Divorce didn't just take away a marriage, it took away the identity she had built around a life that no longer existed. He began attending therapy sessions, not to save what was, but to understand what was inside him that had allowed everything to fall apart without him realizing it. She found herself facing a moral dilemma that gnawed at her in silence: had she been a victim of circumstances or an architect of her own ruin? At each session, she was forced to confront not only the pain of loss, but the shame of having caused a breakdown that affected not only her life, but the lives of others around her. The betrayal had been a trigger, yes, but what devastated her most was the discovery that her choices had not only hurt her, but they had hurt those who she should have protected most. In the small apartment he now called home, Daniel didn't talk about Anna with anyone. Their involvement had not evolved as perhaps expected. There was a connection, no doubt, a shared history amidst the chaos, but something was missing. Maybe it was time, maybe it was the weight of guilt that hung over them both. Anna was present, respected silences, offered support without charge. But Daniel found himself trapped in a cycle of self-knowledge that didn't allow for new roots before the old ones were firmly uprooted. I didn't want to build another relationship on the rubble of a previous one, I didn't want to repeat history by just changing names. It was during a Sunday afternoon, while organizing boxes of old papers and documents, that Daniel found something that made him stop. An old card, written by Lara in the first months of their marriage. Her handwriting is still fresh, the text is short, but full of affection. "You are my home, wherever we are." He read that sentence like someone reading a failed prophecy. He held the card in his hands for minutes, thinking about how words spoken at the height of love can turn into blades when love is lost. He kept the card, not out of attachment, but as a reminder of what was once true. There was no more anger. Just a kind of longing without desire, a mature nostalgia, without a desire to return. Meanwhile, Lara faced a disconcerting reality. I started to receive invitations to events, literary fairs, lectures. His name was trending after a text published weeks earlier gained prominence on a cultural blog. It was a fictional tale, but heavily inspired by his own story. Someone read it, shared it, and now she was invited to talk about love, loss and reconstruction. It was ironic, almost cruel. Talking about what destroyed her life once again placed her in a prestigious position. On stage, she was admired for her sensitivity, for her courage to transform pain into art. Outside of it, he carried the feeling of imposture. Who was she to advise anyone? Who was there to inspire? But with each event, she felt less of a prisoner of guilt. Not because he forgave himself completely, but because he understood that pain, once acknowledged, could become something more than punishment. One night, at a lecture on literature and human relations, a man from the audience asked a question that dismantled her. He wanted to know if repentance was enough to redeem a serious mistake. Lara hesitated, swallowed hard, and then responded with a firm voice, even though her heart was racing. He said repentance was the beginning, not the end. That it was necessary to look inside with brutal honesty, accept the role one played in the tragedy and, from there, start walking. That there were no guarantees, that sometimes you weren't forgiven, and that was also part of it. But yes, true repentance could be the first step towards becoming someone who would not make the same mistakes. The auditorium fell silent after his speech. She took a deep breath, got off the stage and cried alone in the dressing room. Daniel watched the video of this talk days later, sent by a colleague who didn't even know their story. When he heard her answer to the question about regret, he was silent for a long time. The pain was still there, but it no longer dominated. What remained was a curious respect for this woman he knew so well and at the same time so little. He realized that, for the first time, he didn't feel angry when he heard his voice. Yes, he felt a strange kind of compassion. No longer for her. For both. For the history they lived, for what they tried to be, for what they failed to achieve. That line was something he needed to hear, even without her knowing it. A few weeks later, by coincidence or fate, they crossed paths in a bookstore during the launch of a book they both admired. The meeting was unexpected, but not tense. They greeted each other with a shy wave and exchanged few words. They talked about the author, the event, the projects. They didn't talk about them. But the way they looked at each other carried a muted understanding. There was no more hurt, nor desire. There were only two adults who knew, with stark clarity, how easy it is to lose something precious when you live as if it were eternal. Lara left the bookstore with a heavy but light heart. Daniel, in turn, stayed a little longer, bought a copy of the book and walked slowly through the streets, feeling for the first time in a long time that he no longer had a weight on his shoulders. At night, in the silence of the room, he finally allowed himself to imagine a new love. Not Anna, not a known name, but a new idea, a path not yet taken. I no longer felt like I was stuck in the past. I felt like I could finally look ahead. But the dilemma that was emerging was different. Because now, each of them was faced with the possibility of starting over. And starting over, for those who have already hit rock bottom, requires more courage than continuing. It was necessary to decide whether they would let the pain shape their next choices, or whether they would have the courage to bet, once again, on the unlikely. Lara received a proposal to coordinate a literary project in another city, something that would take her away from everything that still tied her to memories. Daniel was invited to a new position at a sustainable architecture company, far away, with the chance of international travel. They both silently knew that the weather was beckoning them forward. But before that, each person would still need to make one last decision. One that would reveal whether they were ready to leave the past in the past. Because sometimes, to move forward, you have to say goodbye, not just to people, but to the version of yourself you became while everything fell apart. And this goodbye hadn't happened yet. On that morning with clear skies and mild temperatures, Lara climbed the steps of the small auditorium where the award ceremony for a national literary competition was taking place. The project he had been coordinating for months with beginning writers had been nominated for an important award and, to his surprise, chosen from among hundreds. He wore a discreet but elegant outfit, and he had a maturity in his eyes that he didn't have before. Behind that more serene face, there were still recent scars, but now healed. Upon entering, he recognized faces, received greetings, smiles and looks of admiration. She was being seen again, but in a different way. Not because she was someone's wife, nor because she was remembered for a mistake, but for something she built herself. When her name was announced as the person responsible for one of the best projects to encourage reading, the audience gave a standing ovation. She walked onto the stage and, for a moment, stopped, looked at the audience in front of her, and understood. It wasn't redemption. It was a restart. And that was more than I could have dreamed of months ago. On the other side of the country, Daniel walked among the greenhouses of an ecological farm with his phone in his pocket and his eyes attentive to every detail of the new projects he was leading. His routine now mixed nature, architecture, and sustainable planning. The company offered him a space to start over with purpose. He taught techniques, managed teams, and in his free time wrote reflections that went viral on professional social networks. But it wasn't fame he was looking for. It was peace. And he had found her there, among the sound of leaves in the wind and the damp smell of living earth. The days became simpler. He led a solitary life, but never lonely in soul. He felt whole. There were nights when I read old notes kept in old notebooks, pages that talked about construction, about love, about loss. He had allowed himself to feel everything. He had allowed himself to fall and, more than that, chose not to remain fallen. Now, every step was lucid. And love, he knew, would come at the right time. No longer as a foundation for what was missing, but as a celebration of what already was. Anna, in turn, had moved to the countryside after the end of her brief attempt at a relationship with Daniel. There was no fight, no drama. They both knew, with the maturity that suffering imposes, that wasn't love, it was an echo. She went back to teaching, moved away from social media, and avoided talking about the past. When someone brought up the subject, they responded with a calmness that came from the understanding that certain mistakes cannot be corrected, only accepted. On long walks through the tree-lined streets of the new city, he discovered that silence can be a powerful ally. I didn't seek to rebuild old friendships, I didn't want forced reconciliations. Anna learned, the hard way, that not every truth needs to be told, and that not every pain needs to be shared to be healed. I was alone. And for the first time in her life, that didn't scare her. Lara's parents, who watched everything from a distance with their hearts in pieces, returned to a closer relationship with their daughter after months of distance. Her father, more reserved, never openly commented on the betrayal, but it was he who called her the night he found out about the award and said in a choked voice that he was proud. Her mother, always more expressive, visited her frequently, helped organize events and smiled when she saw her daughter being recognized not as a victim, but as the author of her own reconstruction. The family bond, once shaken by shame and silence, had been resumed without speeches or promises. It was remade, the way true bonds are remade, with gestures. Months later, Lara received a proposal to launch a solo book. A compilation of short stories about new beginnings, losses, and impossible forgiveness. The project was ambitious and, at the same time, very intimate. She hesitated for weeks before accepting. Writing those stories would force her to relive pains that were still pulsing, but she knew she couldn't remain silent. No more. She felt like she owed it to herself, but also to all the people who had gone through emotional hell and were still trying to rebuild themselves. I didn't want to teach a lesson. I wanted to show that surviving was also an act of courage. And, at the end of the work, he included a discreet dedication, without a name, just one sentence, to whom one day was home and taught me to start over outside of it. Daniel, upon learning about the book, bought a copy online. He read little by little, one story a night, and with each page he felt something like recognition. Not because he saw himself directly in the stories, but because he realized that, between the lines, there was something they had already shared, humanity. In the end, he closed the book with respect. There was no need to call or write. He just kept the copy on his small shelf, among the architecture books and memories that no longer hurt. After that, he began to be invited to lectures on corporate ethics and emotional balance in pressure environments. He spoke calmly, without dramatization. And, in one of those encounters, he met a woman who smiled with her eyes. They talked for hours about art, purpose and silence. There was no rush. There was no charge. There was just presence. Daniel finally felt that his heart could be touched again. And left. Lara continued publishing, but never wrote about her own story again. He had closed that chapter with dignity. She preferred to delve into universal themes, giving voice to characters that weren't her. She became a mentor to young writers, judged competitions, and launched free literary workshops. He built a new reputation, but not based on oblivion, but on transformation. One day, during a lecture, a young woman approached her and said that she had discovered her story in old videos on the internet. He expected to find a dejected woman, but he found strength. He asked how she had managed it. Lara smiled and replied, accepting that the worst part of me doesn't have to be the last. Anna, now living a discreet life, watched her former friend's achievements from afar. I felt neither envy nor superficial regret. Yes, I felt a kind of gentle melancholy. He knew there was a price he would pay forever, lost trust. She knew Lara would never forgive her completely. And he accepted. Because he had learned that sometimes, the only possible forgiveness is the one that comes from within, and that only serves to free us from the weight of hating ourselves forever. So life took its course. No forced reconciliation. No turning back. Just the continuous advancement of people who made mistakes, suffered, faced pain without hiding and, above all, made it a driving force to prevent it from happening again. The end of a story is not always a return to the starting point. Sometimes it's the birth of a new road, one that begins where many think it all ended. And now that you've come this far, tell me, what would you do if you were in Daniel's shoes? Or in Lara's place? Do you think some betrayals can be forgiven? Comment your opinion below, I want to know what you thought of this story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the next impactful narratives. Every week there's a new story that can change the way you see love, trust and choices. And remember, this channel does not support, encourage or justify any type of betrayal. The stories told here are fictional, with the aim of provoking reflection and showing how certain choices can have irreversible consequences. Until next time.